Once again, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this program that is part of our series of nature talks with the Mid-Coast Audubon. And here tonight, representing the Mid-Coast Audubon is Will Broussard to tell us a little bit about their organization and introduce tonight's speaker. Will, take it away.
Thanks, Julia. Once again, my name is Will Broussard. I am a board member with Mid-Coast Audubon, which is a chapter of Maine Audubon. We promote the long-term responsible use of natural resources through informed membership, education, and community awareness. For more information about what we do, along with our membership and membership benefits, please visit midcoast.maineaudubon.org. So I have some updates for us, some field trips, and some upcoming programs for the month of March. Saturday, March 5th from 10 to noon, we will be having our annual spring bird seed sale, supporting our programs and our bird feeder stations in classrooms and libraries. And coming up on March 12th, Saturday, March 12th, we are going to be heading down to Biddeford Pool for a field trip exploring the East Point Sanctuary, which will be exciting. Coming up on March 17th, we have our next installment of our evening nature talks. This one will be with Scott Weidensaul, and his talk is titled Messing Around with Birds, and this is going to be stories from his long career spent working with birds in a variety of research settings. So that should be a real hoot for all of us to see Scott again. All right, so turning to tonight, we are pleased to host Dr. Paty Matrai, who is the Emerita Research Scientist with the Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences in East Booth Bay, where she works as a biological oceanographer, specializing in air-sea interactions with an emphasis on biological processes, especially in the Arctic Ocean. Her many years spent on field expeditions to the Arctic, Antarctic, and temperate regions with a sprinkling of tropical cruises makes her a wealth of information on our oceans as well as on Arctic climate change. So we're very happy to have her back with us to share her latest research news from the Arctic.
Paty, you can unmute yourself.
Unmute. Yep.
Perfect.
First thing, gotta unmute. Yeah. And then I will share my screen. And while I do that, thank you for coming. I'm honored to be back at this adventure. Last time it was in person, so we'll see how this one goes. So here we go. There it is. Can you see the screen?
Everything looks perfect, Paty.
Wonderful. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about changes in the Arctic Ocean from a biological perspective, and you will see how it goes. And so, as Julia said, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes about science. I'll stop sharing at that point, take some questions, and then I'll go on for another 10 minutes or so, though it could be hours, as to what is it that we do when we go out, okay? So when we think about Arctic, most of us, myself included, think about gorgeous animals such as these polar bears or seals or large fishes. And we think about the fisheries that are happening, especially on the Pacific side, large and small fishes, or large gigantic crabs that inhabit the bottoms of these very cold waters. There are also many birds. Of course, I added these photos in your honor. And here you'll have to identify, there are some Arctic terns, little auks, some mures, some kitty wakes, and seagulls and guillemots, and many others. But some of these birds form these large, enormous colonies. And there's hence the interaction here. You see a whale with these very, very large numbers of birds that one can see. Usually in the sun waters of the Arctic, there is a certain latitude above which we never see any birds. And so what are these charismatic megafauna resources based upon? Of course, my favorite, charismatic microflora, also known as phytoplankton or microalgae, and the microbial food webs of plants, animals, bacterials, viruses that they support. Unlike the charismatic macroflora, these are in the hundreds of micrometers in size. As you see here, these are some microscopic micrographs of various types. And so what controls the growth of these organisms anywhere in the world, but especially in polar regions and in the Arctic? Sunlight, of course, which then will shine on top of our Arctic Ocean. And here we have a deliciously tropical drink as my proxy for an Arctic Ocean, with, as you can see, a gradient in which it is all liquid, but not all the liquid is the same. And so this sun shines both light and heat into the surface of the Arctic Ocean, which translates into ice melt. There are other freshwater inputs that I will mention in a minute, but it also warms the surface. And that freshwater and that warming results in what we call stratification that prevents vertical mixing of this entire water column. Of course, most of the phytoplankton want to live where there is light, so it is in that surface layer. Yet, the goodies, just like in this glass, are at the bottom. And so, unless we have a way of getting in the ocean the nutrients which are below the surface during the summer, towards the surface so that we can replenish this water column, we will end up with plenty of light when it's late spring, summer, and perhaps early fall, but not enough nutrients to produce more productivity. It's the same as in our terrestrial plants or our house plants, where at some point during the growth season, we will add some sort of fertilizer to ensure that they keep growing. And so I will bring this back up. How do we mix this? Well, in this case, I'm using the straw here, which was where we would blow bubbles. But in our case, in the environment, the natural environment, it will be wind. And so I mentioned here the melt of the ice and other sources of fresh water, because in the Arctic, and right now, it is the primary control for stratification and the this mixing of the waters. So the main source of increased fresh water is the decline in sea ice cover, the melting of the sea ice. And so what we have here on the left-hand side, the white panel, we have the extent, millions of square kilometers of sea ice. Note, this is for the month of September, which is when the minimum of sea ice, so the end of summer, happens. And the bottom, we have time from the 1980s to the 2021. And we can see a clear decreasing trend. Of course, there is much change. There are some years like 2012, which is the lowest sea ice extent, but there are others in which it is above this trend. The second thing that is changing is the age of the sea ice, which translates into thickness. Here again, we have September. This is 84 on the left, and the blue is first-year ice, and the red is multi-year ice. The image on the right shows sea ice age or thickness this past September. And what you can see now that there is a heck of a lot more white where there is no sea ice, and most of the color is blue, showing that we have lost almost all of the multi-year ice we're lucky if we have what we call second year ice. And so we're losing ice about 2 to 13 days per decade. What we're also losing is snow cover. And so here we have ice cover in September. This pink line is the median, and you can see that there is now a lot of open water. Now, for the growth of phytoplankton that want light, that's excellent, because now they have a lot more light that reaches the surface. But this translates into a lot more fresh water from the sea ice, and that prevents the nutrients to get to the surface. Now, I want to show you that sea ice has not disappeared. This is the sea ice when it is at its maximum extent, which is in March. And you can see that sea ice extends all the way to the tip of Greenland, within the Labrador Sea, and then all of the way there. So this is a lot of sea ice that is being melted. The second source of fresh water, which is increasing, are the discharge from rivers. And on the left-hand side, we have the major rivers in the Arctic, some of which are part of the top largest discharge river in the planet. And on the right, the red dots show the Eurasian rivers, so off in Siberia and Russia, where the blue lines are the North American rivers, and both show an increase over time from the 40s to the present. There is an increase in precipitation, but it's actually very variable spatially. And of course, around Greenland, as many of you may have heard, there is an enormous amount of enhanced glacial melt, but which seems to be rather regional at this point. These rivers, even though I've shown you just the major ones, are all around North America and Europe and Siberia, such that there is what we call a contiguous with a G, because it's not continuous, source of fresh water all the way around what we call the Mediterranean Arctic, which is an ocean surrounded by land. And this transition from the continent to the ocean is not quite what we're used to around here in Maine, where it's a pretty well defined border. For example, the Penobscot, the Sheepscot, the St. John River. There are these very large deltas filled with lakes and rivers and ponds, all of which are now changing, especially with the thaw of the permafrost. And this thaw of the permafrost is not just really resulting in erosion, as we see on this top left image of an Arctic village in which it's losing its soil. It also, there is that thaw of the permafrost is releasing groundwater, of which we actually know very little. And it results from an optical perspective, all of these blue lines on these three images on the right-hand side from the Beaufort Shelf in Canada show the sediment plumes that are extending into the coastal ocean. And so if we have all of this sediment, even though we're losing ice, are we gaining light because we're losing light, or are we losing light because now the waters are all more turbid? And so if we come back to my proxy for the ocean, this loss of sea ice might actually make a little bit dirty if it turns out that in the coastal waters where most of the productivity is happening, we now have what we call color dissolved organic matter coming from the rivers. It's that tea color of the river waters everywhere, and suspended solids from the groundwater and the sediments that are happening there. And so now we come, what does winds do in this part? Well, wind is what drives turbulence, the mixing of things. The top left panel is how we've always thought about the Arctic. There is a mass of ice, and that prevents, and even if in the summer when there's broken sea ice at the ice edge, prevents the wind from having much of an effect into the surface of the ocean. There are waves, but tend to be internal waves. Now, with this enhanced area of open water, the wind is acting upon the Arctic Ocean the way we're used to see in the Gulf of Maine. Waves, upwelling, changes in temperature. And so it is mixing much more without the presence of the ice, the waters underneath the surface, and in our case, resulting in enhanced productivity. So what do we see from that perspective? What we have here is an annual cycle from January to December, where there's polar night at the beginning, spring comes, the sun rises above the horizon, and now we have light through September, and then it becomes dark again. When the light shows up, and with the heat, snow melts some, there's ice algae growing underneath, then comes phytoplankton microalgae, they bloom, just like we have in on land. A lot of that carbon goes down to the bottom. To the extent that animals start to feed on it, the system becomes what we call hydrotrophic, and the productivity decreases until we get into the fall. What's happening now? What's happening now is that the growth season has extended. And so it starts earlier and it lasts longer into the fall. And because of that starting earlier, even though snow is melting, we have blooms, giant blooms, which are now extending under the sea ice. But unless we have a way of mixing nutrients from below the surface waters to the surface, we end up with the same harvestable production, if you wish. And so this extreme seasonal variation that we are used to is disappearing, with a lot of emphasis on more growth into the fall. So we are moving from more simpler ecology. The top panel shows what I have just, another depiction of what I just showed you on ice-covered waters or seasonal ice zone waters, to ice-free waters, where the ecology is becoming much more like temperate waters, with many more organisms, and most of it residing in the upper water column, rather than having a link towards the bottom. And so I indicated that I would also talk about models. And one of the ways to project what might happen into the future is by using models. In the Arctic, and actually anywhere, the best models integrate physics, chemistry, and biology. And regional, or we call Earth system models, link ocean, land, and the atmosphere. So what I have here is output from one of such models. This is a regional model out of Norway called SINMOD. And what we have here is prime production. What plants produce that is then available for herbivores to consume, and then the rest of the food webs. Just to guide you a little bit, on the right side, we have Russia and Siberia. Here we have Scandinavia with Norway. This is Spitsbergen. And here we have Greenland, and then Canada to Alaska and the Pacific side on here, and the North Atlantic is on the bottom left, okay? And so this diagrams show average production in grams of carbon per meter square per year today. And what I really want you to pay attention to is mostly the colors. So we can see that in this transition zone between the North Atlantic and the Arctic, between Scandinavia and Greenland, this is the Greenland Sea, the Norwegian Sea, this is the Barents Sea, with the Arctic Ocean being blue. Most of the production is in this region, these Arctic seas, in the Arctic Ocean being pretty much blue, lower productivity. It's not showing the sea ice, but it's there. And the panel on the right is showing the projection for 2100. And so we see a decrease in these regions where it was very dark red, where it is very dark red today, and an increase, South Svalbard, and then moving towards Russia, the Laptev Sea here, the East Siberian Sea, and then towards Alaska. If we look a little bit more in depth regionally, now I have the same region, but is between 2050 and 2100. Again, we have Scandinavia on the bottom left and Russia on the bottom right, Svalbard or Spitsbergen right here, and Greenland, and with the Arctic Ocean here. We see the colors are the same, that everything is getting a little bit warmer. So there is productivity that is moving into the ocean. There's more growth and towards Russia. But by 2100, right? So this is an increase. There's an increase over here as well. Even more moving towards the Laptev Sea and East Siberian Sea. But there is a decrease in the Greenland Sea and in the Barents Sea. Now, you should note that if there is phytoplankton growth, there will be zooplankton growth. These are the microscopic animals that are the preferred food for fish. And most of the fisheries currently happen off Greenland and in the Barents Sea, where fisheries, Norwegian fisheries, Russian fisheries, but as we know in the North Atlantic, fishermen all the way from Spain, just last week, there was very sadly a fishing vessel from Spain that sunk off Labrador, and they were harvesting these fish, which, as the phytoplankton and the zooplankton move, will also move north and northeast. And so, well, the fish larvae might have grown further south. Now we get into the point as to whose fish are those? And hence, now comes a whole bunch of other stuff that I will address in a minute that has to do with diplomacy and economy and safety. And so I don't have time to address today, but if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer. I've only addressed this connections from the perspective of prime production. But there are teleconnections between what happens in the Arctic from the perspective of climate change that connect our climate here in Maine, right? We hear a lot about the polar vortex. We don't hear it as much in the newspaper from the perspective of what we call Arctic oscillation. It affects our weather here. It affects all of these incidents of extreme weather, even though the intensity of hurricanes. It definitely affects the flow of fresh Labrador water into the Gulf of Maine, and hence the balance of North Atlantic warm water that comes in from the south and this flow of cold water that comes from the north. These are all active areas of research, not necessarily in my laboratory. But I want to bring us back. I have mostly concentrated on what controls these charismatic megafauna in this panel on the top left. I addressed a little bit as to what may be happening in certain Arctic villages, but we should not forget that there are Arctic people who have lived there for for a very long time. And so there are issues now that I will bring up that are new issues. Some aspects are good, some aspects might not be so good. And so to begin, here is a map of what are called the Arctic Indigenous homelands. As of early 2000, it was the most recent map that I could find. And the darker the color, the larger the share of the indigenous population, of the total population. In other words, in Greenland, in certain regions of Canada and Quebec, over 50% of the total populations is indigenous population. While in other areas in Russia, in Finland, it's below 5%. Alaska is about 10 to 25%. Their lifestyles, their livelihood, their modes of transportation, the nature of their villages are all being affected by these changes in the Arctic. And so there are other scientists within the social sciences who are actively examining and this is examining some of these social aspects of the changes in the Arctic. This is a report out of the Polar Institute within the Wilson Center that addresses not just climate, of which I just gave you but a taste, but also the communities, what they call commodities. This is all of the exploration and extraction for things like oil, gas, fisheries, which I touched a little bit, the increase in tourism, the change in forestry, because the same things that are happening in the ocean are happening on land. There is a greening of the Arctic. There are, of course, issues of commerce, and main one has to do with marine traffic. The US has yet to ratify the UN Law of the Sea Treaty. This enhanced traffic brings all kinds of ships. Sometimes they make it, sometimes they don't, which means if they don't, they need to be rescued. Then there's issues for the Coast Guards. And there's this connectivity between the environmental issues that I have brought up, as well as social, economic, and geopolitical. Maybe just before the pandemic, I was in a meeting related to the Arctic Council, two meetings actually, one here in the US and another one in Norway. And in the one in Norway, I happened to sit in a table, and there were some people from Russia. I could never quite determine what their profession was. There were journalists from the US. They were people that seemed clearly like police from Norway. And so the conversation was very open. And effectively, the Norwegians said that their deployment of security to the far north is intense. They use the term, we watch them and they watch us. And so this brings in the importance of the Arctic Council, where the Arctic nations, plus several interested nations, which are called, discuss so as to maintain a peaceful environment for things like shipping, fisheries, science, exploration, and especially new Arctic-specific governance. Since we can't really apply what happens in temperate oceans to an area that has the element of ice, of frozen ground. And hence, lastly, it brings this issue of competition among nations, including safety. So with that, I will stop here. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll be happy to take your questions about this.
Thank you so much, Paty. At this point, I invite folks to please go ahead and type any questions you might have into the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, or into the chat if you would like to share there, or your resources. Paty, this is a very interesting topic. This is something that the Camden Conference, in fact,
Yes,
tackled
indeed.
last year.
Yep, absolutely.
And I did want to point out that we do have a number of recordings at librarycamden.org of some of the programs that we did. If you are looking to do a very deep dive, specifically, we had a conversation with Senator Angus King, who serves on a lot of Arctic committees or
Yes.
deals with relations with the Arctic, and he brought up specifically how these changes are going to, in his perspective, affect a lot of mains industries. Can you talk a little bit about that, and with your research and the folks you've spoken with, how you see mains industries evolving?
Yeah, so when the Arctic Council met, the Arctic Council, which are the 7 Arctic nations, the chairmanship changes every 2 or 3 years. And right now it is Russia, and before it was the US. And Senator King was very influential in bringing some of the meetings to actually Portland, Maine. Some were in Alaska, and many were in the DC area, obviously. And so there's the opportunity with the opening of shipping, and Senator King wants to and has done very well in positioning Maine as the entrance to the Arctic from the US. Of course, the Canadians will say the same thing, and with the waters around the Labrador there. And so that opening into the Arctic would allow for lots of things which we produce here. For example, anything that has to do with wood to move north. There are other things which are not as, well, I don't know if I use, it is what it is. For example, right, lobsters and a lot of other fisheries are moving northward as well. And as all industry, whether it's Maine or other places, move, there are folks who are already there. So this spirit of cooperation, that I'm highly sensitized to that. So this is my own personal, that we, Maine or anybody else, including scientists, don't arrive in Arctic lands and say, here we come, we know exactly how it needs to be done. Yeah, it has to be in the most respectful and cooperative manner. and then we can all succeed.
Yes, I
And
mean,
this was discussed a lot at the Camden conference. This, the social economics governance of this, into which the science forms the base from which all of these decision making should be based upon.
yeah, I mean, when you think of the scale and I think perspective, we think of, well, our industries are going to change. We're not going to have lobstering anymore. And that's shocking to Mainers to think about something like that. It's been an industry that's important to Maine for, 100+ years. To then consider the indigenous populations that you've mentioned, in just a few generations, they're talking about their entire lifestyle and everything that they've depended on for hundreds up to thousands of years being overhauled, but in just such a short amount of time. So I really thank you for bringing up the social aspect. I think it's something that gets takes a back seat often, unfortunately, to some of the more shocking science behind, our coastlines are going to disappear, that kind of thing. Will, did you have any questions that you wanted to ask Paty before we moved on? It doesn't look like we're getting anything in from the audience at this point.
Well, there were a couple topical news articles just this week. One was the record lobster haul, and that was a combination of really high prices, I would think, right? But also just I guess the natural movements of the lobsters in their yearly kind of migration around the Gulf of Maine. But I'm curious, for folks who are skeptical about climate change happening, what do you say to folks who look at that kind of information and they're like, well, there's the record haul, clearly nothing's happening and it's great, but obviously the lobsters are moving from somewhere to somewhere else, right?
Yeah, the lobsters are moving. That's undeniable. The haul in dollars was extremely high, if not one of the highest. But the haul in pounds was much, much lower than previous years. And so economically, they did very well. Ecologically, not so well. And so what we see also, and there are folks at Bigelow who study this, is that the larval recruitment of the lobster is declining tremendously. This is research that Rick Wally and David Fields do. And so the big question is, how come if the lobster produce thousands of eggs and the little larvae are right there, how come they're not making it to the bottom? They need to grow to a certain stage and then make it to the bottom in order to grow to larger sizes, which actually takes several years. And so there have been experiments which are showing that it is the combined effect of temperature, warmer waters, ocean acidification, and then in my case, we looked at the presence of microplastics. And so that the smallest of the larvae, because there's about 7 larval stages, lobsters have a very complicated life, are actually quite sensitized to microplastic. But once they get to a certain size, the size that is the one that settles, they're very good at either getting rid or simply rejecting microplastic particles. So at each stage, there are things which are happening and they will just continue to happen. I mean, it's what was in the Chesapeake Bay and it's no more.
Paty, John had a question. He would like to know, what is the impact of the melting permafrost on methane gas releases? We've been following that
question.
It's a little bit more. He says, we've been following that subject for about 5 years now, since we learned about it in a video documentary called Years of Living Dangerously.
Oh, absolutely. So I had a slide, but I took it out in order to stay within the 30 minutes. So methane release, methane is stored frozen within the permafrost in the form of what they call clathrates. So it's frozen in there. The largest sources of methane frozen in clathrates are actually in the coastal ocean, very near to shore, deeper, more pressure. So it wouldn't take, so back up, methane is several orders of magnitude more effective as an agent of warming than CO2 is. It's just that it has been stored and it is the product of degradation of organic matter when there is no oxygen. And since the planet is covered with oxygen. So that's the risk. And so what do we see? Do we see more methane coming from permafrost from land? Not so much. Do they measure more methane in lakes, of which there are so many in the Arctic of different sizes? Yes, they do. But the same warming is allowing for bacteria that consume methane in those freshwater lakes to actually consume it. And there is, if you're more interested in that, there's research from a scientist at Bigelow called Beth Orcutt, who has been looking into that. And so the main concern are the methane bubbles coming out all along the Arctic near shore. And there we have less measurements because it's so difficult to get there. So the ships don't want to get in too close because there's sea ice and it gets shallow quite fast. The big ships that we use, icebreakers that can deal with the ice. So we need to have smaller vessels, but we can pretty much only get there in spring or summer, once the sea ice is no longer there, especially what we call land-fast ice. We could get there with a helicopter, but the helicopter will only get there when it's frozen or way in the summer again. So we miss the shoulder seasons when it's very difficult. Some people have said, oh, but it's not a problem. We just take a truck. And I go, and what road are you going to follow? And where are you going to get gas? Yeah, it is just that type of infrastructure does not exist there, has never existed, because transportation has happened mostly during winter in frozen ground or ground covered by sea ice so as to get into the coast. So did I give you an answer? No, because what we are using to do that are these models, really. Yeah, it's a pending question.
Will, do you want to tackle Steve's question?
So Steve asked, we're seeing changes in bird migration already due to many other causes. Is there a place for the great nesting colonies in the North Atlantic to move as their food sources make these huge changes?
So on the North Atlantic side, I could see, this is going to be a pure guess because you know more about birds than I do, that they could move to Svalbard, to Nova Zemlya, and to several of the islands which are off the Laptev Sea and into the East Siberian Sea. On the Pacific side, less, right? So they can move many of those, that photo spectacular with the whale and the birds, that's in the Chukchi Sea. And now they could move perhaps into the Beaufort Sea, but there aren't very many islands there, you see? And so if the wrong type of phytoplankton and the wrong type of little fish move in, sort of like what happened with the puffins here in the Gulf of Maine, or there is a mismatch into the timing when the phytoplankton are growing and the animals in their own ontology continue to come out later, 2 weeks later, they will miss that. And we're already seeing that. So there is already a decrease in bird population or in the recruitment of young ones, both in the Atlantic side and in the Pacific side.
Thank you, Patty. We before we hop into your portion about life on a research vessel, David had a quick question harkening back to the methane. He wants to know if there are any remote methods to measure coastal methane release, like satellite, anything like that.
So not satellite, because methane doesn't have a color. Yeah. And so we would be able, what we would do, like for CO2, is develop a relationship with the parameter that can be remotely sensed, like temperature, for example. Yeah. What we have been trying, and I had some of those, is to develop methods that can measure methane autonomously. And so 2009 to about 2016, we deployed these ice tethered buoys that would measure CO2, a variety of halogenated gases, temperature, and things like that, and with lithium batteries, and then they would transmit those data via satellite, and would do that. We never were able to add a methane sensor because the methane sensor was too big and consumed too much energy. And it made that buoy even bigger. Now they are doing some of that methane sensor, that type of methane sensors can be deployed on land. And folks are doing some of that in more remote areas. In more remote. So they are doing that. And those sensors nowadays should be able to survive winter conditions. They might not be able to survive some of these other conditions that I'll show you in a minute.
All right, thank you so much. And those were the questions that came in. So if you'd like to jump into the next portion, we'd love to see it.
Okay, all right, so let's go back, share. Let's go down to, come on. Okay. So when we do research in polar regions, we have effectively two modes, and this is on the ocean, not on land. We can either take an icebreaker or an ice-enforced vessel, of which in the top left, there are two here. You can see this little, can you see my cursor, Julia?
Yes, I can. It looks good.
Okay, all right. So here is the German Polarstern vessel and a Russian icebreaker. And here's what we would call an ice flow. And this is what would be either in the marginal ice zone. So open water would be down to the right, except that in this case, they were like at 82 or 84 north in September, October of 2019. And this is what the ice was. And they were looking for a piece of ice that they could anchor to and use as a year-round platform. And so that's one, we either stay on the ship, on the icebreaker, or we do an ice camp, that is called. On land, it's the same thing. Those are ice camps in certain parts. And for example, in the Antarctic, on the Antarctic continent, they are stations which are on land on glacier ice, okay? And so you can see how small these vessels are. And then the bottom two photos show the Polarstern during the polar night. And no, I've been at those latitudes and all the way to the North Pole on the Swedish icebreaker, the Odin. And this is the view. No, this is the mothership. And one walks on ice to and from the ship to do one's research, which is happening on board of the ship as well as on the ice. And so, for example, This was the ice camp at 87 North in 2008, about 5 kilometers by 3 kilometers. You can see here, the Odin on the bottom left corner. And we would sample the ice, we would sample the open water, and that's what we call leads, which are spaces within there. And then there were all kinds of instrumentation deployed on the ice, such as this. And so here we have a deployment at the North Pole Observatory, which is an ice camp managed by the Russians, which has now, unfortunately, it's too dangerous. And so the Russians are building a vessel that looks like a platform that they will tow to the North Pole and leave there. And it will be ready maybe in 3 or 5 years. And so to the North Pole, one would fly in a small airplane. And then one either uses a snowmobile to tow, this is one of our buoys here, or simply use manpower, and so this one was an experiment done on Barrow in March at the maximum extent of sea ice for safety reasons. This is an experiment done in the Beaufort Gyre. Here you have a Canadian icebreaker, and then we were moving with helicopters, moving equipment, and we drill and we do things and deployment there. And all of the setup can either happen inside the icebreaker as much as one can to minimize the amount of time on the ice for safety reasons and also for temperature reasons, because there's lots of electronics like they're being exposed here that don't like the cold. And so what do we deploy? We deploy things either right at the ice-ocean interface. This is a small remotely controlled vehicle to collect the surface layer, and we call it surface microlayer, or collect water from the edge, to deploying things from the edge of the ice, to measuring underneath the ice with either little mobile labs where we will create a platform and then put things that will hang maybe 100 meters under the ice, to measuring the atmosphere and setting up these poles to put instrumentation up to 20 meters into the air, to things which are satellite based. Either send meteorological balloons that sample by themselves and transmit the data to a satellite, or use the ice tether balloons, as well as having instrumentation on the icebreaker. These were cloud radars. Whoops, no, not so fast. In an enormous amount of instrumentation inside the labs of the ship. We also have used helicopters. Sometimes we pull out the back seats and fill it with instrumentation so that we can sample the top 1,000 meters of air. And one time we even have an airplane that flew above us from northern Norway. And they were quite scared because they needed to make sure that they had enough fuel to make it back, since there's no place to land. There are lots of hazards. One of the main ones, most unpredictable and dangerous, are the beautiful polar bears. Here you have a picture of one inspecting something, and hence there is polar gardening that we all have to do, and hence we get trained to use properly and safely use rifles, daytime and night. I can't imagine being polar bear guarding at night. Here are, when I said that, if instrumentation survives, this was a photo taken by the camera in one of our instruments. The camera took the polar bear there, and you can see that afterwards, there were several sensors that the polar bear was too curious and simply destroyed. They love flags. Oh, they love flags. Whether the flag is red or black, just like this, it's an attractant. And then these days, it is ice cracks. And here we have, since we used snowmobiles to pull equipment, this one is a small one that if this person goes back and then throttles full bore, they will jump over. Here they have the issue, the equipment is on sleds, trying to move it over to the other side, always closer to the ship, because this melt pond is a direct connection to the ocean below. The darker it is, the deeper it is. And this, unfortunately, was lost one night. We had the same thing in 2018. These two came together, they form a ridge, and that's, in their case, that's what they were able to see. In our case, the entire, all of the instrumentation disappeared, swallowed. And so here you have several of these before and then after. And sometimes we end up staying on the wrong side. And in which case, if it's big enough, they'll put a boat or they'll bring the helicopter. But that's the end of the experiment, since safety is paramount. And then we have cold, 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 just like we've had in January here. And then this hoar will cover all of the instrumentation. Even if it's not the right type of plastic, it will just break. It will add weight to something like this tether balloon, and then just bring it crashing along with the instruments that are happening there. Here you have another example where soon this sensor will get completely covered and won't survive. And then there is life on board. One of the main things that we do, two main things: have meetings and eat. And so here there is a meeting of the lead scientist, the captain I can see because of the epaulets. If I am the chief scientist or co-chief scientist, this will be a daily event at 7 o'clock in the morning, for example, to discuss what happens that day. And then there will either be a presentation of the daily activities as it's happening here, or there will be science presentations or safety presentations, lots of meetings. But what can make or destroy an expedition is the quality and the quantity of the food. And this one is a photo from Mosaic on board of the German Icebreaker, same thing on the Norwegian Icebreaker, where they bring an entire team of stewards, including a person that all they do is bake. Because the European and the Scandinavian vessels, the 10 o'clock and the 3 p.m. coffee break is sacred. And so here you have trays showing that. Exercise is a big one, and we do everything we can outside, most of us, whether it's walking on deck, and if it's safe, doing some exercise on ice. If they're polar bears, that gets completely rescinded. There are some indoor exercise rooms, but they're usually too small. I know how to cut hair, and what this person is doing here, I have done both in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. I will even trim beards, because this is a very common effect. It's cold, and the last thing guys want to be doing is shaving, and we end up usually with a competition as who can grow the biggest beard. There's always, in these long expeditions, 30, 45 days, or in the Antarctic, a health team. It may be usually as a physician and a nurse, or at least one physician. They can do up to perhaps an appendicitis operation, yeah? But beyond that, it gets quite complicated, and hence health test and all of those things and dental exams before we go are essential. And to go to the Antarctic, for example, impacted teeth are not allowed. You either take them out or you don't go. And this one here at the bottom is to show the importance of communication. When I started going out to sea, all we did was talk on the radio, right? Blah, 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 over, blah, 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 over. Now, with satellite communications, it looks just like a regular phone. And so, and the prices are not that expensive. And that allows for much more better communication, which makes the sense of isolation for both the people on the ship and the loved ones who have stayed on land easier to bear. Because not everybody, despite everything we try, reacts positively to the long days and the isolation, especially when it gets dark. And then there are the surprises. And this one was 2018. I mentioned we had lost lots of equipment. Here, this open lead, well, there was a wind event, and this side of the lead and this side of the lead collided, and all of this equipment disappeared. But in this particular day, there was a different type of event. And I want you to see and look at this object here, where my arrow is. None of us had never seen this. This is the northernmost report for this animal. We were at 89 degrees north. And with that, I think there's one more dive, and I guess he or she said, not edible, don't like it, I'm leaving. And with that, I'll be happy to take questions again. There we go.
Thank you again.
I could spend hours with photos of this.
We could spend hours listening to you. It's fascinating, and it's so foreign for a lot of us to imagine the experiences you must have had on these expeditions. I just thank you so much for giving us such a concise yet holistic look at this whole topic. At this point, I'm going to give another minute or so if anyone wants to type a question in for Paty. Paty, I had a quick one. Do you guys ever do any fishing when you're there? Fishing or crabbing?
No crabbing.
Just fishing.
But fishing, yeah. There's always somebody who has a fishing pole and trying. Have we ever caught anything on any of the Arctic expeditions once one leaves the marginal ice zone, which is where the ice starts? No. There are very few fish, if there are, they're that far north. As you go north, there's very little food in the water. Very, very little. We don't see birds either. It's the same reason. There's just very little food. And that's why that visit was so surprising. We don't see seals either. As we go south, we do. And the presence of birds is the first indication that there is coast or something nearby. Yeah, that's the first indication that we're approaching some sort of land or rock or something.
Thank you. Will, did you want to go with Debbie's question?
Let's see, yes. Oh, great question. Debbie asked, what inspired you to become an Arctic researcher?
So two things. One, I have two colleagues whom I respect, whom I met when I was in graduate school. And they both, their focus was in the Arctic. And at that time, I was doing air sea, and it was mostly in temperate regions. And they said, Paty, nobody's doing this type of research. We really need to look at the relationship between carbon and sulfur in those areas. And so I tried, because most oceanographers want to go to warmer waters. Who wouldn't want to go to somewhere where there are corals or it's easier to swim, than instead of having to spend 20 minutes getting dressed to go outside. And so pragmatically, there also was more funding available. Now there are a lot more researchers focusing on polar regions. So that's how it was. Friendship and opportunity.
Great.
Thank you, Paty. We had a comment that came in that I think sums it up pretty well from Susan. She says, thanks for the excellent presentation. All of your graphics are wonderful, and your oral presentation is both articulate and interesting.
Well, thank you very much.
And I think we all second that. Thank you for taking the time tonight, Paty, to speak with us about this very important topic. And thank you for the work that you do. We really appreciate
you're more
you.
than welcome. Thank you for all in the audience who took the time to come. It's always a pleasure to share.
Will, did you want to mention one more time about what's coming up next?
Yep, just a reminder to check out midcoast.maineaudubon.org for all of our great field trips and presentations coming up. Thanks again, Paty. This was wonderful.
Yeah. All right. So
You're
we
welcome.
are going to be posting the recording on the Camden Public Library Program's YouTube channel. Please be sure to check it out there and share it with folks you know. All right, everyone, had a good evening, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.